Welcome to Westminster Watch. I'm Nick de Bois. On this week's show, we dive into the controversial, lucrative, and sometimes murky world of party finance. Party donors often make heated headlines. Ethics are questioned when it comes to taking certain people's money. Then there's what donors might expect in return. Do parties, in effect, sell titles, honours, influence? And with distrust in politicians already widespread, even if that's not the case, does the mere perception of corruption mean it's time for change? We'll speak to a former MP who's reviewed party funding before, as well as a former government advisor who's seen many a funding controversy. We'll discuss the good and the bad when it comes to the current system, and crucially, how it might be improved. So, where do political parties get their money from? It's a question that crops up every now and then when donors, who usually like to be kept behind the scenes, suddenly hit the headlines. We've recently seen controversy over Tory donor Frank Hester.
Is the Prime Minister proud to be bankrolled by someone using racist and misogynist language?
There were calls for the party to return the £10 million he gave them over alleged racist comments he made. Then there are stories of donors getting awards like Mohamed Mansour. He donated £5 million to the Conservative Party and was recently given a knighthood by Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. And you've got things like long-standing alliances between Labour and the trade unions, which some say gives them influence over the party's policies. So how does the British party funding system actually work? Let's get an overview with our correspondent, Alex Barker. Over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Nick. Let's get straight into it. Parties get almost all their money from voluntary donations. That might be from individuals or institutions like companies and trade unions. There are some limits. Charities, for example, can't donate, and you have to be registered to vote in the UK, or companies need to be based in the UK. And over the years, there have been small amounts of state funding brought in too, like payments to help opposition parties with their costs. But the amount of money that comes from the government is still much less than is common in other European countries. I'm going to hand over now to Professor Justin Fisher, who beams into us from Brunel University, to explain the potential pitfalls of the current system.
Well, there are two potential issues. One is the extent to which some parties benefit more than others. So, for example, it is principally the Conservative Party and the Labour Party that benefits from donations from institutions. And therefore, those parties have historically been much wealthier than any of the other parties that compete in British politics. Now, of course, it's also true that those two parties are the most popular parties, but it remains the case that parties like the Liberal Democrats, for example, have less access to that form of income from institutions. So that's one challenge that's been that has arisen. The second is that when you have private donations from voluntary sources, whether those are trade unions, businesses, or wealthy individuals, there is always a concern that people will regard donations as a means of getting some sort of favourable outcome. Now, in actual fact, the evidence for that is extremely limited, but that in this sense is not the problem. If voters perceive it as such, then that can undermine confidence in democracy. So what we've done in Britain is to introduce transparency rules such that donations over a certain amount, and it's recently gone up to around £11,000. So donations in any one year over £11,000 must be declared publicly via the Electoral Commission. And that's been in place now for the last 24 years. Now that helps because, of course, everything is out in the open, but it doesn't necessarily prevent suspicion about people's motives for making contributions.
And it's not just voters who might think donors have influence either. Nadine Dorries, when she was Culture Secretary, appeared to use the views of donors to put pressure on her colleagues to keep Boris Johnson in power in 2022.
The Conservative Party donors have said themselves that they aren't going to support the party if the Prime Minister is removed. I think a number of MPs in marginal seats need to hear that and need to understand what they're doing. £80 million those donors have donated to the Conservative Party over recent times. It's those donors that have helped us to win the election, and they need to hear that message.
Now, one suggestion that comes up a lot is putting a cap on donations. In 2011, a group of MPs suggested £10,000 a year, which was rejected. A limit could come with its own problems, though. Over to Justin again.
The problem with this is that if you cut off a major source of income by capping the size of any individual donation, there needs to be something in its place. And experience in the United Kingdom has told us that there is not a large pool of untapped money from small donors. So the logical outcome is that if you cap the size of any donation, then you would need to introduce more extensive state funding in order to make up that shortfall. And that has been one of the major sticking points in terms of reforms being introduced. Certainly in 2010, in the 2011 review, there was a concern both that it was undesirable from conservative perspective, but also that at the time there was economic hardship in the country, and it was felt that giving money to parties could not reasonably be justified. I don't think that's necessarily a terribly convincing argument, but nevertheless, attempts to reform party finance have largely failed.
So it's not a straightforward issue, but it does seem that right now people are struggling to trust in politics and in politicians. And rightly or wrongly, even the mere perception of dodgy donors is part of that.
Indeed. Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Justin. I'm joined now by broadcaster and former government advisor, Peter Cardwell. Peter, welcome, and thank you for joining us. Now, look, on that last point about trust, how big a part do you think party funding has played in this erosion of trust in politics?
I think a huge part, Nick. I think this is something that really feeds into how people view politics and politicians. Where's the money coming from and how are they being funded? The amount that we actually pay politicians in the United Kingdom isn't a huge amount. You're talking about maybe £500 million, which when it comes to government funding isn't very much at all in terms of what the state pays. But people really think it's a really huge amount. And when it comes to where the money comes to fund political parties, well, people are very worried about that as well. The level of influence, whether it's in Labour and the unions, whether it's in the Conservative Party and big business, this is a big concern of people. But the money, of course, has to come from somewhere.
Well, let's stick with that little point about trust, because Savanta in March published a poll that showed something like 2/3 of people believed that a large donor would influence a party, influence it in a number of ways, but the most obvious being in return for big donations, contracts. That's what's behind the allegations and suggestions around Frank Hester, of course, who gave £10 million. But in your experience, inside from government, is it that bad, or is the perception far worse than the reality?
I think the perception's worse than the reality, mainly because there are a lot of propriety and ethical rules around the procurement process for government contracts, for example. I worked in politics for 3.5 years. I've been around Westminster for a decade and a half. I've never heard of a decision being made specifically because of a donation. Now, there were, if you go back to Tony Blair's age, certainly there were questions about cigarette advertising in motorsport. That was one when Bernie Ecclestone, the head of the Formula One, had given £1 million to the Labour Party. That was the biggest controversy then. But I think this erosion of trust that you talk about, the post-expenses scandal, for example, the fact that MPs' salaries goes up, for example, and that is an independent body that decides that, yet MPs are always blamed for it. It really just brings me back to the thick of it, that satirical drama about politics, where there's a politician character in it complaining about how much money he earns or indeed doesn't earn, and the number 10 character says to him, the public want you to live in a cave and eat grass. And there is that element that politicians need to earn money. We need to get the right politicians. We need political parties to be properly funded, because they need to communicate and they have a duty to communicate with voters. And people might pick up the leaflet and put it in the bin of the recycling, but they need to know and they need to have the option to be communicated with.
Well, we'll certainly come to that, because without money, democracy actually suffers, many would argue. But let's just stick to the question of trust for a second, because whilst you're right about procurement processes and the fact that, you know, it's unlikely, and it's certainly not as widespread, that big donors are getting contracts in return for large donations. Bottom line is, though, Peter, isn't it? If you look at the link between cash donations to a party from an individual and honours, there's an unwritten deal there, isn't there? Cash for honours.
Well, that is something that is really disgraceful when that happens. You see large donors from major parties being given peerages or given other forms of honours within this country. That's something that is very transparent. And the key point actually is transparency. So people can rail against it, people can have a voice against it. In a democratic society, people can talk about it. And actually, when you look at donors, we now have this floor of about £11,000. So anybody who gives over £11,000 to any political party in the UK will have their name made public, and people will know about that. And actually, decisions being made, if they are being influenced by that, will know about it, or at least can take some inspiration and can see where the money is coming from. So I think this is something that there's definitely work to be done here. It's not a perfect system, Nick. There's no doubt about that. And I actually think anybody giving money, any substantial amount of money to a political party, should be banned from receiving an honour.
So come on then, what's the going rate for a knighthood?
Well, I mean, when you go back to I think it was Lloyd George was done for this back in the day, but certainly there are various donors who will make that donation thinking, well, if I'm a consistent donor and I've given a lot of money, and people who've also brought money in to different political parties. We've seen a succession of treasurers, the fundraisers of major political parties, who've been given money as well. But the alternative, I suppose, would be state funding, and that's a whole there's a whole can of worms within that as well, which I'm not particularly happy with.
Well, let's talk. Let me pick up on that, because I think, first of all, some people might think, well, we're just talking about money. Why should there be money at all? Let's be clear. You agree, don't you? Money to fund the activities of political parties. It's a crucial part of democracy, isn't it?
Absolutely. And political parties need to be able to come up with manifestos. They need to be able to communicate with people. Look, most political parties in this country, in fact, all political parties in this country, are mainly made up of volunteers. If you're paid, if you're an MP or something like that, you're in the minority of people who knock the doors, put the leaflets through the doors, talk to people, and try to campaign for political parties. That's going on as we speak, because the local elections are coming up in England and parts of Wales on the 2nd of May. But those people need, the money for those leaflets needs to come from somewhere. The money for people who work in party headquarters needs to come from somewhere. You do need an infrastructure behind it, because if you don't, then you have a very amateurish organisation.
Okay. But then if the public, on the one hand, are very worried about the influence high donating individuals can have, corporations, businesses, trade unions, on the other hand, the solution seems obvious. Make taxpayers fund the political parties, because that gives a neutrality to the whole process. Taxpayers should be happy with that, shouldn't they?
Well, we have the highest level of taxation as a proportion of what the country makes in the UK in 70 years. And I think if you go to people in a cost of living crisis and say, more of your taxes are going to be taken away from crumbling schools, roads, hospitals, and being put into political parties, even if it's just a small amount of money, I don't think the public will be happy with that. There's also the point of, how do you do it fairly? Do you say that it is on the basis of party support, for example, that you give money to those parties, that the number of votes they get, for example, means they get a certain amount of money? Well, or how many representatives they have. Well, there's one party in the UK, for example, that only has one MP at the moment, Reform UK, that is going really high in the polls. Should we give them more money? Should we give them less because they don't have enough representatives?
Okay.
You know, that whole area is a big area of conversation.
Legitimate caveats in there. But the reality is, since 2010, the Liberal Democrats, the Conservatives, the Labour, they've all agreed the system is bad, can be rotten, needs changing. Peter, why in 14 years has nothing really been done? It's as worse as ever, isn't it?
There's no incentive for it to be done. There are a number of arguments in British politics. This is one of them. Reform of the House of Lords is another one, where all political parties say we want to do something, something will be done, but actually when it comes to it, it is very politically unpopular to say to taxpayers, well, actually we're going to take some of your money and give it to political parties.
We do it already, though, don't we?
We do little bits of it.
You have a little bit of money going to the opposition.
Yes, short money it's called, yeah.
So the principle's accepted.
The principle is accepted, but I think if people knew that, and I think if people were more aware of it, and also were saying, right, we now give £10 million or whatever it is, we're now going to give £100 million or £1 billion or whatever it is, I think that it will be a big political argument. I think a lot of people will be very annoyed, and if their taxation is going directly to a political party, they really don't like.
What about, one last question for you, what about state funding could also be a deal with the taxpayer? They reduce how much funding goes into politics. That would be a good thing. Wouldn't that open it up to other parties, for example?
It perhaps would, but it has to be done in a fair way, and it also has to take into account the realities of politics. Sending out leaflets, for example, sending out communications to people who are at home in England, for example. So the cost of a second-class stamp in 2000 was 19p. Now it's just gone up to, I think it's 85p. So that inflation, will that be built in as well? That's a big question.
Last yes or no question for you. State of politics now, would you donate to a political party?
No.
Peter Cardwell, thank you very much indeed for joining me. Author of Special Advisors, former Special Advisor himself, and of course broadcaster. Peter Cardwell, thank you very much.
Thanks, Nick.
Going to let you go now, Peter. I'm going to turn to former Labour MP Graham Allen. Now, Graham actually chaired a select committee which reviewed party funding back in the 2010-2015 Parliament. Graham, welcome.
Hello, Nick.
I'll ask you the same question that I asked Peter Cardwell, if I may, is how big a part do you think the question of party funding has had in eroding trust in politics?
I think it's been very significant. It always was significant, but everybody in politics, whichever party you're in, they all seem to get together and say, this is terrible, this is something we have to do something about. And there were inquiries, reviews, ministerial statements, even my own select committee, all of whom said we have to do something about this, but government never seized the nettle. And I think we are reaping the whirlwind now over the recent years, because I think it doesn't take a genius to read the polling that's out there at the moment, which is showing massive distrust of politics. And much of it stems from the stories that are generated around this political funding of individual parties.
We'll certainly talk about individual donations, and we'll look at some of the suggestions you both put forward in your report back in that Parliament and the future. But first of all, let me ask you this as a former Labour MP. Do you think Labour's financial dependency on the unions is healthy or corrupting?
I think that all parties' dependence upon big donations is wrong. I think if it's not corrupting, many people do see it as corrupting. And the stories that we read in the media underline that. So even if it's just appearances, and I think there's a little bit more than that, but even if it were just to be appearances, it is something that we ought to do something about. And there's enough reports stacked up over previous years to actually come forward with a consensus. But Nick, I've got another suggestion. It seems that people in politics are incapable of reforming themselves. So my suggestion would be that we set up a citizens' assembly, a microcosm of the UK without people with a political side or partiality in one direction or another, and ask those people to go away, have a look at these things with a really serious deliberation, not lining up against each other in party lines, but actually getting together, speaking, moving forward, and producing a report and recommendations, which then, of course, parties or government can set aside, but let them come up with some ideas. And I suspect they'll be very much like the ideas that were around 10, 20
Well,
years ago.
Graham, if I may,
They'll have that
and
legitimacy of coming from the public.
if I may, let me speak directly to that point, because, you know, do we really need another committee, whether it's citizens or politicians or whatever, to state the bleeding obvious, some might say? So let's look, for example, at cash for honours. Now, there is nowhere has there been any evidence that a deal is struck that says, you give me and this political party this money and I'll give you an honour. But look around and you see people getting knighthoods who've recently donated large chunks of money. That's wrong, isn't it? And let me ask you this. If you don't change, what we've seen in the Conservative Party with effectively cash for honours, are we going to see it again with Labour when they, or if they, form the next government?
Well, just to answer your very first point, Nick, yes, it is stating the obvious, but nonetheless, politicians are bound by their loyalty to their parties not to do away with anything that influences the financial well-being of their own party. So, although we know this is not good, we know it's an awfully bad look, if nothing else, we need someone from outside, which is the basic idea of a citizens' assembly, who can tell the truth to us and to everyone else and give us a reason or an excuse or a set of recommendations to move forward. On the honours question, I think we all know, whether it's written down or whether there are phone calls to be traced or whatever, pretty clearly the biggest donors seem to end up remarkably in the House of Lords or with knighthoods or whatever. And I just think that is something that people outside cannot believe is not corrupting.
But is it because
people do this for a reason? They do it because they think they're going to get something out of it, and that's the same with people who donate to the Lib Dems, the Labour Party, or any of the other parties. So
you could see it happening again.
Nick,
you can see it happening again under a Labour administration or anyone.
Absolutely. So I think there's always a moment, Nick, you know this, you've experienced member of Parliament, you know the best time to move a change is immediately after a general election. Parties don't get more radical in government, they get less radical. Politically, that's the time to strike.
Well, let's talk about that.
We're going to make some changes now.
We're going to have a new government, one way or the other, probably Labour. Let's talk about the future. You looked ahead at the future. You see a role for the taxpayer to intervene and help support political parties. Do you think that has any chance of gaining approval, particularly as we're emerging, or still in for some, a cost of living crisis?
Yes, I think we saw that old argument rolled out when Hayden Phillips did his report. We saw it rolled out when my select committee did my report. You know, we have to tackle this. It's no good keep dodging it and saying the public won't like it. I think if you've got, as I say, a citizens' assembly, effectively the public speaking, having thought seriously for many weeks or months about this, I think ordinary people would say, rather than have people outside throwing millions at political parties, let's clean it up. Let's take this this opportunity to do this. And actually, if you look at the numbers, it's about £1 a year for every person in the country.
Okay, well, that might
put a kitty together, which actually allows us to carry on and do these things without having the influence of big outside money coming in.
That might,
and they do it, by the way, in lots of other countries.
Well, they do to a higher degree than we do here, because we already have some state funding going on. But it might stick in the throat of some taxpayers. But let me push this boundary a little further with you, if I may. You're suggesting the trade-off is we'll have no cash for honours scandals because you'd have to cap donations. Effectively, you would be stopping these large donations. Where would you put the cap on the amount that people can donate?
Well, another beauty of a citizens' assembly is that people like myself and you, Nick, don't make those decisions. You leave it to the good common sense of people to come to an agreement, having seen evidence on all sides of the argument and working it out effectively. So I think I believe in the common sense of the British people that we have a serious problem here, and they could step in and make some sensible recommendations about where a cap should be or how much individuals should be allowed to spend on their own election. Actually, Nick, I think you'll probably support me in this, a good cross-party alliance in terms of, I think our local spending limits in an election for candidates are ridiculously small. And I don't know what they are actually now, because I didn't fight the last election.
It's about 15p a voter, which is not a lot. Quick yes or no answer for you.
Yeah.
Would you now, with toxicity in politics, the scandals, the honours, would you donate any money to any political party?
I
Yes or
never
no?
have. I never have. I don't intend to. We need a proper system that people can see is completely without corruption, and that will be very inexpensive. So we should go for that and ask the opinions of citizens. And I think that will be one step to cleaning up what people see as politics that don't deserve our trust.
Graham Allen, former Member of Parliament, chair of the select committee that looked into the issue of funding. Thank you very much for joining me. And don't forget to subscribe to the TRT World YouTube channel for more lively debate and conversation. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.